G'day and welcome to Perkos podcast, a podcast all about strategy, leadership and soul care. We're here to help you obtain your personal, professional and spiritual goals without losing your soul. We hope that today's episode is refreshing and gives you a new perspective. Now here's your host, Jason Perkins.
Well, g'day everyone and welcome to episode 35, part 1 of Perkos podcast. I hope that it is well with your soul today, wherever you are tuning in from around the world. I'm especially glad that you tuned in for this particular episode because we have a great conversation coming up with a mate of mine, Rich Villodas. Before I introduce you to Rich though, I just want to remind our listeners that we have some great events coming up on Perkos podcast. One of the joys of getting to do what I do is helping leaders reach their goals without losing their souls. And I do that through coaching and facilitation of some events online that help leaders to care for their souls. One of my favorite ones is what's called the Emotionally Healthy Leaders course with Pete and Jerry Scazzero from Emotionally Healthy Spirituality. We have the Emotionally Healthy Leaders course part 1 beginning on May 3rd down under here in 2022. And this particular course is really focused on helping us as leaders to be able to give what we do possess. Oftentimes as leaders, we find ourselves trying to give something that we don't possess, and that's impossible. I know for many years I struggled trying to help other people follow Jesus closely, while all the while I was struggling as to what that looked like in my own life personally. And we all know the truth that we can't give what we don't possess. So this particular course is going to focus primarily on your inner life with Jesus, so that as leaders, especially those of us maybe leading churches or faith-based organizations, we can actually lead from the overflow of our own relationship with Jesus as we help others discover the riches of that relationship with Him as well. So I want to encourage you to register for the Emotionally Healthy Leaders course, part 1, again beginning May 3rd, 2022, down under. All the information about it you can find on my website, jasonperkoperkins.com. Click on the upcoming events tab, and that'll take you to all the information for this. Or if you follow me on Instagram at jasonperkoperkins, there is a link in my bio to the registration for the Emotionally Healthy Leaders course beginning on May 3rd. I highly encourage you, if you are a leader that wants to reach your goals without losing your soul, this is the course for you. Now, let me introduce you to my mate, Rich Villodas. Rich is the Brooklyn-born lead pastor of New Life Fellowship, which is a large multiracial church with more than 75 countries represented in Queens, New York. You may be familiar with New Life Fellowship as it is the church that Pete and Jerry Scazzero, who I just mentioned, they started this church and transitioned the leadership of the church about 10 years ago over to Rich. Rich holds a Master's of Divinity from Alliance Theological Seminary. He enjoys reading widely, preaching, and writing on contemplative spirituality, justice-related matters, and the art of preaching. He's been married to Rosie since 2006, and they have 2 beautiful children, Karis and Nathan. His first book, The Deeply Formed Life, is the topic of some of today's conversation, along with many other things, including his love of New York sports and the best places in New York to find great Puerto Rican food and good pizza. I hope you enjoy part 1 of my conversation with my good friend, Rich Villodas. Rich, so good to see you, mate. Hey, thanks for jumping in on this conversation and being a part of Perkos podcast. How are things in Queens, man? How are things right now in New York?
Well, Perko, so good to be with you. Thanks for the kind invitation. Queens is Queens. I mean, we are the place where you're going to get amazing food in New York City, yes. A place where the diversity is out of this world. And, 2020 was a very difficult year for the entire world, but Queens was on the global in the global news as kind of the epicenter of the pandemic, especially the first few months of the pandemic. And so while we are still experiencing to some degree, I think some collective PTSD, things are coming back to normal little by little over here in Queens.
Yeah, good. Hey, you just mentioned something. This is totally off script, but I've got to ask anyway. You mentioned some of the best food in all the world in Queens. recommend a place for great Puerto Rican food to us, man. You got to do it.
Oh, a great. Well, in Queens, here's the interesting thing about this. In Queens, I cannot think of any Puerto Rican cuisine.
Okay.
There's some places in Brooklyn, some places in Manhattan.
Yeah.
There's a place in my neighborhood in East New York. There's some of these small. There's not like these massive places. One place called El Rey, the King, which is on Liberty Avenue in East New York, Brooklyn. So that might be one place, but it's usually these little mom and pop shops.
Totally.
That you're going to get the best food.
Absolutely. Okay, so this is so stereotyping, but I got to ask, best pizza joint, where would you recommend?
Wow. So there's a few. In Queens, there's a place, if you're familiar with Ray Romano, everybody knows Raymond.
Yes.
He grew up in a neighborhood in Queens called Forest Hills.
Okay.
I live in this neighborhood. And so there's a place called Lillian's, and Ray Romano's pictures are all over the pizzeria, because he still frequents there from time to time when he's in the neighborhood. And so Lillian's is where you're going to get a wonderful classic kind of New York slice. Yeah. And then there's a place called Nick's Pizza.
Okay.
So for those who are listening and they live in the New York City area and they've never had Lillian's or Nick's Pizza in Forest Hills, two brilliant, wonderful, amazing places.
All right. We'll put links to all of this so that people can find it after the fact, man. This is super cool. I love it. Hey, we always do this thing on the front end of the podcast where I just do some either or questions. And I want you just to say first thing that comes to your mind. This is to help the listeners just to get to know you a little bit. So we call it 60 seconds with Perko, but to be honest, it typically takes a bit more than 60 seconds. All right, here we go. Coffee or tea?
Coffee.
Okay. Apple or PC?
Apple.
Beaches or mountains?
Beaches. I'm in New York. So beaches. Yeah.
Yep. Dogs or cats?
Easy. Dogs.
Okay. Netflix or YouTube?
I'd say YouTube.
Okay. Call or text?
It depends, but I'd say text.
Okay. Podcast or music?
Music.
Okay. That's disappointing, especially considering the platform that
my father was a DJ. He still is a DJ.
Okay.
So I have this profound love for all kinds of music, hip hop in particular. So I love music so much. So yeah,
I love that. I love the fact that your dad passed on that passion to you, man. That's a super cool thing. So cool. Absolutely. I love that. Yeah. Passenger or driver?
Driver.
Okay. And saver or spender?
I would say saver.
Okay.
I would say saver.
Okay.
Yeah. I spend too much on books, as my wife could attest. But I say, generally speaking, because I came from poverty, there's that anxiety about that. So I say saver.
You were formed. Your financial formation
is deep in my bones.
Yes. All right. Final question. Probably one of the most important leadership questions of all time, my friend. Toilet paper, are you over or under guy when you hang it?
Well, I mean, it's over, and that's only because my wife, before we got married, it was just, I closed my eyes and just put it on, I just figured it out as I went. I don't recall the last time it's been under. We've been married 15 years. It's been at least 14 years since the last time it's been under.
Okay, that's right. So what you're saying is you're a quick learner. Like it only took a year to really help you get it sorted.
Certain things you just got to learn quickly. So I learned my lesson.
Yeah, very cool. Hey, mate, I am super stoked to have you on the podcast. Ever since I read your book last year, Deeply Formed Life, I've been keen to chat about it and to share the message of the book with those that listen to the podcast. So thanks for your willingness to be able to jump on and have a conversation. Yeah. Before we dive into some questions about the book, though, especially for our audience that are down in the Southern Hemisphere that maybe not as familiar with your background and kind of your ministry life, that kind of thing, would you just give kind of a brief overview, especially some of the formative influences? You mentioned your dad, maybe talk a little bit about where you went to college and then ministry experience you've had.
Yeah, so I grew up in East New York, Brooklyn.
Yeah.
I'm 42 years old. So in the 80s and 90s, it was one of the more notorious neighborhoods for drug addiction and drug use and violence. So that's kind of the environment I grew up in.
Mm.
Lots of incredible, wonderful memories and joy, and lots of pain and lots of, I think, trauma from the level of violence that I witnessed. But it was in that neighborhood where I met Christ.
Wow.
And as a 19-year-old, came to faith in Jesus, myself and 15 family members,
Oh,
my
wow.
parents, my brother, my siblings, my sisters, cousins, uncles. That's another story for another time, but
Wow.
a remarkable kind of household conversion, multiple
Yeah.
household conversion story. And so it was at that point where I heard about this college, a Christian college in the New York area. I didn't know Christian colleges existed at that time,
Okay.
and heard a Christian college for those who want to study more of the Bible and theology. And I thought, wow, that sounds like exactly what I want to do.
Yeah.
And so started attending this school called Nyack College, where I studied theology and pastoral ministry, and then went on to get a master's degree in MDiv at Alliance Theological Seminary.
Yeah.
And then from that point on, serving in various churches, became a young adult pastor at this big church called the Brooklyn Tabernacle in New York.
Yeah.
I did that for a few years. And
Yeah.
then as a 28-year-old, came across this church in Queens called New Life Fellowship, where it was pastored by a guy named Pete Scazzero, who
Yeah.
wrote a lot of books related to emotional health, emotionally healthy spirituality, emotionally healthy church, and emotionally healthy leader, all the emotionally healthy stuff,
Yeah. Yeah.
and didn't realize that his church was about 20 minutes from my home.
Okay.
And I had picked up his book, didn't make the connection that he was in Queens. And I was recommending his book to everyone. This is about 2007.
Wow.
And then looked at kind of the back cover and thought, this guy's in the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Had no clue. And it was at that point where serendipitously, a pastor from New Life emailed me and asked to have lunch to talk about a ministry event. And by the end of the conversation, he was asking if I wanted to apply to a pastoral position at New Life.
Wow.
And to which I said, send me some information. And a few months later, I was leaving Brooklyn and heading to Queens.
Wow.
And so that was me at 28, 29 years old.
Yeah.
About 4 years later, I became the lead pastor of New Life. So succeeded Pete, which was a big surprise because I was not anticipating that transition.
Yeah.
And I have been in this role. I'm beginning my 9th year in this role as the lead pastor of a community where, fairly large church for New York. 75 nations represented, 123 languages spoken in the neighborhood. 50% of Queens is foreign born, so it is quite an international place.
Wow.
And a beautiful place. I think a sign of the kingdom of God that I'm so grateful to pastor.
Yeah, that's super cool. I love your story, Rich, and I would love to, for another day, unpack more of that experience of your whole family coming to faith. Like that's incredible, man. I'd love to hear that on another conversation. You mentioned, Rich, that you took over for Pete, and you've been in the lead pastor role now for 9 years. Looking back, like many of our listeners are maybe younger listeners, and they're not necessarily the point leader in their organization, or maybe one day they perhaps will move in to that role in their organization or another one. Looking back on those 4 years or even before that, is there anything that you wish, now that you've been leading for 9 years, that you had focused more on to prepare for the unique leadership, challenges being the point person? Anything you wish you had worked on?
Well, I think my initial years, especially my first 2 years as the new lead pastor at New Life, were marked by a sense of anxiety that I had to prove myself as a leader.
Okay.
I'm succeeding a guy who was pastoring for 26 years, best-selling author, known around the world and in New York City as a significant spiritual father of this amazing city of New York.
Yeah.
And so stepping into those shoes, I carried the level of anxiety, like I better prove myself. And so early on, I started thinking, we need to start new churches. We need to be, by the time I got home after the ordination installation service there, I was thinking, we got to start new churches, and much of that was my own anxiety of, I have to prove myself. And by God's grace, we have just a wonderful team of elders and staff, mature people who hear Jesus, who we went through a discernment process with about what's the next phase for New Life. And it was clear as day that there was no chance we were going to plant any church, start a new church, campus, whatever you want to call it, for a while. And believe it or not, I'm in my 9th year. November 14th of 2021 is when we are officially launching our first congregation in another part of New York. So it's taking us 9 years to get here, and it's the perfect timing. It is the perfect timing. So I think for me, the biggest thing that I look back at, and I think part of that was part of my own growth and development, was I don't have to prove myself. The fact that I'm already the lead pastor, someone's believed in me to say, we believe that you can take our church to the next phase. That should have been enough. And being content with all of that. So that's one thing I would say.
Rich, unpack for me, how did you work through, like, what work did you do to come to the point where you're like, hey, I don't have to prove anything besides knowing that people had believed in you? Was there anything you had to work through to overcome that thought, that script?
Yeah, it feels like it's a lifetime of work in many ways. That it's still something that I carry. I don't think to the same degree as when I'm 42. 33 and 42. It's almost a decade here. So that's a lot of time in between when I first said yes to becoming the pastor. I think a few things that have helped me significantly on the journey. And I've said this from the beginning. I need a lot of help. I need so many different people in my life to help me to believe the gospel, that my value is not based on what I can perform, but what Christ has done and my identity in him. I need so many, I'm the pastor, so I'm used to giving that news to people, but I need so many people who are giving me that news. And so, whether it's my relationship with my wife and having honest conversations with her about my own sense of insecurities, whether it's a group of 3 pastors that I meet with, usually the first Wednesday of each month, whether it's a counselor or a spiritual director, or our executive team, which is really what we spend a lot of time on the soul, not just trying to figure out, all right, what's the next mountain that we need to climb. I've needed so many of those people to remind me, to encourage me, to refocus me, to recenter me. And so in many ways, I don't know if it's anything I've done. It's been so many of the people around me that have generously and kindly reminded me of who I am in Christ.
Yeah, man. Sounds to me a lot like community is a major part of that process. And it's such a big deal. Hey, I've heard you on other podcasts or other conversations. I've heard you talk about some clarity around what you feel like God has uniquely gifted you in. I know that you love to preach. I've heard you say that, and you feel gifted in that area. But you also sound like you're aware of some of the shadow side of things in your world as well, like just in conversations I've heard you talk about. Can you describe the work that you've had to do to gain clarity on that? Like, hey, this is the unique giftings and I feel confident in these, but these are the shadows. What does that work look like?
Oh man. For me, I owe much of this to my predecessor, Pete Scazzaro, who created an environment, first of all, where we were able to and are able to look at our dark sides, our shadows. And so in some ways, some of this emerges out of our genograms. We have a very high value of utilizing genograms, which comes out of family systems theory. which is a way of just identifying the ways that generational patterns, generational sins, if you want to call it, generational trauma, and the messages that flow out of that, multi-generational connection there, how that impacts us. And so much of my own formation of identifying my dark side has been connected to my own family of origin. And so the scripts that I carry of, I have to hold everything together. I have a way of overfunctioning. Part of my dark side is overfunctioning, doing for others what they can and should do for themselves, which leads me to overwork, which is why, we preach and write the things that we need most, I preach on Sabbath and contemplative life and slowing down and limits, because I am so prone to taking on much more than I can chew, and going at a pace that's chaotic, and not paying attention to my soul, and living on the surface. And I'm an Enneagram 7. So, pain avoidance is a big thing. And I want to, I read something, I forgot which Enneagram book it was, that they said the 7 on the Enneagram is the kind of person who's like eating candy all the time, and at the supermarket, and you have the quarter, and you have the bubble gum machine there. Yeah. And it was so funny. I was listening to a podcast one day about the Enneagram 7, as someone was talking about that, and I was at the supermarket with a quarter in my hand, about to get a piece of bubble gum. Just like I like fun, man. I don't want pain. And so my shadow side is I could lie. My shadow side is I could be an optimist to the point of being someone who denies reality. These are the parts of my shadow that I've had to come to terms with. And I think all of the skills, these Genogram, if it starts with a gram, so Genogram, Enneagram, Instagram, probably not Instagram, but a lot of the grams I've needed to help me identify some of my own dark sides.
Rich, you said something there, mate, that I just want to make sure we don't miss. You said what we write about, what we preach on is what we need the most. I'm going to add to that, whatever podcast that we host because we need the most. Honestly, man, like the theme of this podcast, the whole vision of the podcast is helping leaders reach their goals without losing their souls. And that is because of my own journey of reaching my goal, but forfeiting my soul along the way. And I just don't want that to be true in my own life. And I hope it's not true for other leaders. And so, man, what we need the most, we tend to host. So that's the thing that I think we take away from that is it's so important. Well, listen, mate, I would love to dive into the book, some questions about your book, The Deeply Formed Life. Fantastic read, mate. So thankful for the book. It's in the category of spiritual formation. At least that's kind of the category I put it in. I don't know if that's what you intended, but seems to be in that category, even based on the title. You bring some brand new perspectives, at least for me, some perspectives that I haven't seen maybe as well articulated or focused on, some values that you talk about. Before we talk about those values, though, why another spiritual formation book? Because this is a category, mate, that has like classics, Christian classics in it. Did you see a gap, or did you see maybe a deficit in the Western church when it came to spiritual formation? What's the reason for it?
Part of it, there was a deductive flow to it as well as an inductive flow to it. And but by that, I mean, deductively, I began with a particular goal in mind, not to write a book that would tackle contemporary issues from a spiritual formation perspective, from a broader cultural perspective. That came inductively. I started trying to offer some things to the people I'm leading in New Life Fellowship in Queens. So it came out of, the way I try to explain it is, it flowed out of pastoral concern, where in the same way that Eugene Peterson, this is kind of the parallel that I think of, Peterson translated or paraphrased the Bible into the Message, but it did not begin with this project. Okay, I want to go from Genesis to Revelation and rewrite all of it. It didn't start there. It started with, I got to help my people understand Galatians. And so let's start with the book of Galatians. Let me try to figure out how to give the people I'm leading accessible language to understand the Bible.
Yeah.
And then one thing leads to the next, and next thing you know, we have the message. I think in a very similar way, hearing people ask questions, Pastor Rich, when you said racial justice or reconciliation, and they asked all their questions, or I've preached something in a sermon, and maybe I didn't have the time to really give nuance and the kind of clarity that I wanted around it, and someone sent me a mean email saying, I didn't like how simple and simplistic you were with that. I just thought, these emails are driving me crazy, So,
well, you're writing a book when you respond. I may as well turn this into a chapter.
That's exactly right. Some of these emails are crazy long. And so then, and then I can't just give like a 3-sentence response. I have to give tons of thought into it. And so much of it came out of pastoral response. How do I, and urgency, how do I serve the people that God has entrusted me with to understand the particular values that have formed our congregation for many years? And so it began there. But as I was writing, I think it became clear to me that addressing some things that, as we do at New Life, within the category of spiritual formation, I had not really seen it.
Okay.
And so, like, the stuff that I write about is not me saying, these are the cultural issues that we need to talk about, and here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was, here are the 5 values that we pay attention to most in our congregation.
Yeah.
And so that's what I want to write about.
Yeah.
This is what we've been living for over 3 decades. This is what I want to write about. And so it wasn't so much that I noticed a gap in the spiritual formation kind of department, but it was more so, this is the stuff that I'm preaching and trying to practice every day of my life.
Yeah. I think, Rich, perhaps that's why it resonates so well, is because it's coming out of what people are facing, not just in Queens, but around the world. I mean, during 2020, we had similar protests and things here in Australia down under for activities and wrongs that were happening on the other side of the planet. And so I think it's resonating with people in a really powerful way. Hey, you write about,
and I'll just say it was only after the fact where an aha moment where I thought, I think part of what I was doing was trying to offer a reframing of spiritual formation for our generation. And yes, it was ambitious, but that was honestly my goal into it was, I need to help the people who God has entrusted me with. And by God's grace has extended a bit beyond our community. Yeah,
so good. Hey, mate, you talk about these values, these 5 values. You start off with one, which is a classic. And honestly, I wasn't introduced to it before we pressed record on the podcast. Rich, I told you I was introduced to this kind of contemplative rhythms and contemplative Christianity about 5 years ago. Has been transformational for me in my life. And I would love for you to just share, how do you define those contemplative rhythms? What are some examples, and which do you think is most lacking for Christians today? What would you say is the most lacking?
Yeah, well, I would say how I define contemplative rhythms, if I can just give big picture, is a life that intentionally slows down to be with God.
Yeah.
That's, if I could, in the simplest way possible, an adjustment to the pace of our lives that helps us pay attention to the ways that God is near. That's a contemplative rhythm. The way that I have tried to articulate rhythms is there's so many contemplative rhythms to choose from. And so I had to be pretty intentional with the ones I focused on. The ones I focused on, 3 primarily is silent prayer, Sabbath keeping, and the slow reading of scripture.
Yes.
And I think those, for me, have grounded me over many years. By God's grace, I was introduced really to the contemplative tradition really early in my life. So I was probably about 21, 22 years old when a professor had me read a book by Henry Nouwen, a book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. And I was so moved by the book I went to the school library to read some other stuff he wrote. And because he wrote small books, it was really nice to read them and get through them quickly. And I read one book and then I read a book called The Way of the Heart, in which he writes about the Desert Fathers. And so I thought, who are the Desert Fathers? And so I started reading the Desert Fathers, and at that point was opened up to this world of the contemplative tradition. But over the years, those are the three practices of silent prayer, of Sabbath keeping, and of the slow reading of scripture that has shaped me significantly. And you know, I think you could say, in terms of the greatest need or the glaring gap within Christians, you could argue that all of them. But I would say the contemplative prayer, that silent prayer, is often so lacking because a number of reasons: the pace of our lives, but beyond just the pace of our lives, the ways that we've understood prayer. So much of prayer is understood as verbosity, and I have to use a lot of words to try to get God to do something that I want. And so prayer is so often transactional and not relational. And I just need to say words. I need to throw holy words at God and see what sticks. And that's not prayer. And so I think that's probably the biggest gap of how do we have lives that are marked by deep prayer. And I think that informs everything else.
Rich, you recently, I think, talked about this on John Mark Comer's podcast, Live No Lies, around his new book that he's just released. And I'm going to put a link to, I think there's some video out there on the internet of you describing that type of prayer. When you talked about it, it reminded me of this scientific process of photosynthesis. I oftentimes refer to like silence is like sunlight to the soul. You can't see what it's doing, but man, it's feeding and it's doing all that sunlight does to the plant. And man, when you were describing it on that podcast, again, we'll link to it. It just was a powerful reminder that we think we're doing all of the work in prayer, and yet it's really just positioning ourselves in a place where he can do all of the work.
Yeah, it is quite a deal.
It's a great deal.
We show up and God does the transforming. I mean, that's a pretty sweet deal. I mean, it's like going to the barber shop. I just got to show up and sit down and hopefully entrust my head to a good barber. And by the end of it, I'm looking pretty good and I'm feeling good and I've done nothing except show up.
Yeah, exactly. So this value of contemplative rhythms, honestly, Rich, has been so transformational for me that I could stay here like for the rest of the podcast, but we got to move on. Here's the deal: silence, solitude, slow reading of scripture, Sabbath. These are not like emotionally eruptive practices. Most people would go, yeah, I could get into a bit of silence. I could get into a bit of Sabbath, maybe slow reading of scripture, that kind of thing. But you go into a couple of other values that I wouldn't call emotionally neutral. Racial reconciliation, sexual wholeness. These are not mainstream in the discussion around spiritual practices and formation. I would love to know what's been kind of the primary pushback you've gotten over the years, not just from the book, but maybe even before then, in these two areas. And let's start with racial reconciliation.
Yeah, I mean, tons of pushback. And part of it, I mean, I've experienced pushback at the congregation I pastor, so this is nothing new. That's part of the challenge and the gift of being in a legitimately diverse community where people have the space to actually articulate their frustrations and perspectives. And so I've received everything at New Life and outside New Life, things like the fact that you're bringing up race is perpetuating the race problem. We should be focusing on the gospel, not focusing on race. And so that's kind of a classic one I get at least every 3 months or so. Then there are other ones like, I talk about race and racism on 3 levels: individually, interpersonally, and institutionally.
Yeah.
And so people have no problem talking about the individual thing. They don't have much problem talking about interpersonal, but when you start talking about institutions and systems, the demons start coming out.
Yeah.
And so I've gotten pushback related to the institutional nature of racism. People believing that because we've had a Black president, that we have entered into a post-racial world, and if we were not, if we were still a racist country, or a country dominated by a history of racism, we would not have come to this point. And so I get that pushback regularly. And then I think probably the biggest pushback that I get, it's not everyone, but there's certain people who, in the chapter, I intentionally wrote when I was writing about racial habits that form us in chapter 4, that we have to renounce whiteness. And to use that category of whiteness triggers a lot of people. And I think I worked really hard in that chapter to try to delineate, because I've made some errors in preaching, that I think you can see some of my learnings in the book of moving beyond flippancy and moving beyond narrow categorization, that these things require nuance, that to talk about whiteness is not to talk about white individuals or white people. Although, white people are probably the primary carriers of whiteness. But as I mentioned, someone had interviewed me, and I'm not sure if this is the best analogy, but I'll say it nonetheless, that, the COVID positivity transmissibility rate is very high. The same is true with anxiety, and the same is true with whiteness in our Western culture. And so part of it has to do with how I've tried to define terms. But yeah, I get pushback on a regular basis. I'm kind of used to it. It's not always easy. Sometimes it's very stressful. I just want people to read my book and go, wow, thank you, that helped me. That's the best. I don't want to hear, well, you're race baiting and all that stuff there. That stuff can get pretty stressful as well. But on the race end, I've heard some things.
Well, and I'd love for you to tell me, so what do you say to that pushback? But here's what I'm going to say, because that would take a book, obviously. That is the book. So I'm going to say this, go read the book, because Rich talks about these things in the book and really gives, I guess, in some ways, a response to some of that pushback. Let's go to the sexual wholeness space. Pushback in that area. What are the classics that you tend to receive?
Well, on one level, some of the pushbacks, it has to do with just the fear that people have around the conversation. Particularly church people. To talk about sexuality within a congregational Christian space, for some people, so foreign. We had a conference on emotionally healthy leadership a few years ago, and part of the conference was talking about sexuality, and the pastors, it was like a marriage pre-conference for married couples. And Jerry Scazzaro, Pete's wife, got up and started talking about penis and vagina, and you could see the level of and discomfort, and these are pastors in the room, just like, oh, I can't believe she said biologically appropriate words to get at our sexuality. And I thought, wow, we have been so formed to avoid any notions of mature conversations regarding our bodies. And so part of the pushback has been just the discomfort that people have along those lines. I've also had people, who want me to go further. I mentioned at the very beginning of one of the chapters that this book was not going to treat the larger realities of like the LGBTQ conversation. That there are plenty of other resources for that. And some people think that's a cop-out, and some people think I should be more vocal on what I believe, or be more affirming, or whatever it is. So it's kind of, those are the classic kind of points of pushback where, again, I get this within my own congregation. And so on some level, I'm pretty used to it.
Well, listen, if any of these pushbacks resonate with you that are listening, you're going to have to go grab the book to find out how Rich responds to these things. Cause they're fascinating. And I appreciate, Rich, that you would stick your head out and talk about these two values that are not mainstream when it comes to kind of spiritual formation stuff. Like, that takes a lot of guts to say, hey, I'm going to go there. So I really appreciate that.
Sometimes I think I don't look at it often as courage. I look at it as naivete. I think the Lord blinds me or conceals from me what I'm actually doing. And so sometimes I get up and I preach and somebody goes, that was really courageous. And I go, was it?
Was it?
I gotta listen again. Maybe I said some things I shouldn't have said. So I think it's my own naivete and my blind spots.
You find out just how courageous you were in the emails on Monday morning.
Exactly right.
Yeah. Hey, one of my favorite, it is my favorite line in the book is this line right here. We are called to be active contemplatives or contemplative activists. And then this part right here, holding together the invitation to be and to do. This has been my personal struggle, Rich.
Yeah.
I just am so focused. I've been so focused on the doing. And for many years, Rich, doing for Jesus was not flowing out of much time of just being with Jesus. I actually wrote on my whiteboard. We mentioned, before we started recording, our mutual friend, Lance Witt, when he introduced me to this contemplative rhythms and things, I wrote on my whiteboard, I remember writing, for the rest of my life, I want to be with Jesus more than to be doing for Jesus. And this was around 40 years of age for me. And just so grateful for the introduction to that whole space. Can you share on a personal level, what does that look like? This invitation to be and to do, that balance between the being and doing, what does that look like for you? And then maybe, how do you help a team? If you're a leader listening to the podcast, how do you help your team do that as well, beyond just you as the leader?
Yeah, the best way I can say it is I was formed into this culture. And so this is not something that I discovered. It's something I think I was absorbed into. And so to be a part of New Life Fellowship, the fruit of my own life and ministry flows out of the deep pain that my predecessor experienced with his own life and his own terrible limits, and the ways that he had to reorient New Life to redefine what success was. Which I think, whether you're talking about a team, we're talking about our individual lives, I think the biggest part of embracing contemplative rhythms is a redefinition of success. That success is not accomplishing X, Y, or Z in this amount of time and having this level of impact. Success is doing the will of God, and doing the will of God looks different from one person to the next. And discerning God's will requires time. It requires a level of patience and intentionality. And so I think when I think about how I've been oriented in this way, and I need to just say, even though I've been in this space, in particular at New Life for 14 years or so, this is still an ongoing wrestling that I have. But because of the culture that I have been part of for these 14 years, and because success has been defined in a particular way, it certainly helps me. So what does it look like for me? It looks like 6 p.m. on Friday to 6 p.m. on Saturday, I'm stopping my work, paid work, unpaid work, and I'm holding Sabbath. I'm keeping Sabbath. I'm cultivating delight. I'm not rooting my existence in what I can accomplish, or the sermons that I preach, or the books that I write, or the people that I help. I'm trying to root myself in a different center of communion with God. And so, that's what it looks like. It looks for me of intentionally finding spaces for retreat. I go to a monastery usually every year. Last year was the first year that I really wasn't able to go to a monastery because of COVID, and having rhythms of getting away, for extended periods of time, 2, 3, 4, 5 days, where I am giving myself to rhythms of prayer within a monastery, praying 4 or 5 times a day with monks. That's part of my own personal rhythm of how I do it. It means creating a monastery in my bedroom.
Yeah.
And making space for prayer and silence and reflection. I think it means paying attention to my limits, that we all have limits. I have limits in energy. I have limits in capacity. I have limits in my expertise. And so I have to consistently learn how to say no to a lot of things that I want to do.
Yeah.
And this probably has been the biggest lesson for me. And this is why I've needed my wife significantly to help me name my limits. I don't want to embrace my limits.
Yeah.
As much as I preach it, I want to transcend my limits. I want to break through my limits. And yet there's some limits, many limits. I don't know, maybe most limits are a gift from God.
Yeah.
And so redefining what limits are, and the gift that they are, I think has helped me to live somewhat into this contemplative life.
Yeah. So good, man. So helpful. So thank you for going through that, kind of categories, because I think those are categories that are incredibly transferable, so that it's not going to look the same for every person listening, but yet these are categories to at least consider looking into. So I appreciate you sharing those. Rich, man, there's been a ton of conversation recently around what I would refer to as the failure of celebrity culture in Christianity. And it's not as though recently we find, well-known pastors having moral failures. That's not a recent thing. That's been, happening for years, but it seems like there's quite a bit of conversation around this with, podcasts like the Rise and Fall of Mars Hill. We got Preacher Sneakers stuff going down, which, by the way, I see that you enjoy a good pair of kicks yourself. You spoke,
which let me just, and just for those who are commenting on Instagram, because I posted a picture of my Jordan 1s, which my brother is a crazy sneakerhead. He has all the sneakers there.
I love it.
And so he told me, you need to get these, pair of these kicks here, man. And so I waited 40 plus years before I got my first pair of
Jordan 1s.
And I got 2 of them now. So but they're not like the 2000. They're $175, $180 or like that. So putting in context there.
I love it. Hey, speaking of brothers, I owe my older brother a debt of gratitude. He was playing hoops. I was living down under as a kid, and he was playing hoops in Colorado, playing basketball, high school basketball over there. And he actually brought me back a pair of Jordan 1s when they first came back. It came out in the 80s. And man, I wish I had kept a hold of those and didn't wear them, but I wore them out. Hey, so beyond the sneakers, this whole kind of culture, though, around celebrityism in Christianity. And I actually heard you talk about this at Q Ideas. And I imagine, Rich, I'm going to go out on a limb. I imagine since you took this role at New Life and since the release of your book, I imagine that things like your Instagram follower numbers have probably gone north, not south. And you probably have platforms of influence that you didn't have in the past. And those platforms have probably grown significantly, and even requests have probably grown significantly for you. Can you describe what you feel like is the problem with celebrityism in Christianity and this culture in the church today? And then how are you currently kind of protecting yourself as a leader from it?
My predecessor, Pete, he kind of prepared me for this in many ways, where I saw firsthand, he's a best-selling author. His books have touched hundreds of thousands of people. And seeing the level of exposure, influence, whatever word you want to use, and the ways that it can destroy you. so having him in my corner before I wrote my book, and part of the reason I say this is I think we all need just someone in our corner who's going to tell it to us straight and help us. And Pete, I said, Pete, I'm thinking of writing a book. And he, a couple of weeks later, he came into my office with his legal pad and a whole page of notes, letting me know how this has the potential of destroying my life. I was like, this is not what I was looking for. I was looking for some encouragement. And he gave me, this will destroy your life if you don't pay attention to this and this and this. And, I took it as a prophetic word from God of warning. And so on one level, I think I'm grateful for the ways that I've had someone like Pete, who's been down this road to give me fair warning of what was coming. All that is true in terms of impact and the ways that people are reading the book and all that. I've tried to distinguish, even in that Q talk that I gave, the difference between celebrity and celebrityism.
Okay.
And one is, I think, a reality outside of our control. The other is one very much within our control.
Yes.
Jesus, you could argue, was a celebrity in the first century.
Yes.
Everywhere he went, crowds followed. They were there. I mean, I'm not sure if he signed their tunic and their parchment paper and autographed it. I don't know, but there were everywhere. He was a household name.
Yes.
People knew about Jesus of Nazareth. And so there's certain points of celebrity that we cannot control. For various reasons, people get popular and famous. That's one thing. And I think that's just, but celebrityism, there's a whole nother monster. And it's rooted around a particular now ordering of my life. That's marked by things like entitlement and things like low accountability and things like, my life goal is to advance my platform and to connect myself with those who can only advance my platform. All the worldly stuff, stuff that, demonic stuff that people are a means to an end to advance my platform. And so for me, that's how I delineate, number one. And part of being within a community like New Life, which I think is the antidote to celebrityism, is to be deeply rooted in a community where people are not impressed with you. And you could be sure. My congregation, I know they love me.
Yes.
I know they love me not because they read my book, and they love me not because they heard a talk that I gave on YouTube. They love me because we've known each other, 14 years.
Yes.
And I've been over their homes. They're not impressed with me. The elders that I report to, they're not impressed with me. And so having enough relationships where people are not impressed with me is a gift. And it roots me. It humbles me. I'm taking out the garbage just like the next person. But I think those are some of the things. So very practically, having a board that I report to tomorrow, I report to them at 6 p.m. And we have a three-hour meeting as we do the first Wednesday of each month. And they're asking me questions about my life and about my speaking events and how much I'm traveling and all of that there. Having those relationships, I think, have been critically important to resist the very powerful pull. I mean, my Instagram, all that has probably gone up tenfold in the past year. I think, and that was expected. That's what my predecessor said, this is what's going to happen. But what are the boundaries that we're putting in place? So I'm grateful for a wife who tells me how it is. And I'm grateful for a board who, although it could be a pain in the neck from time to time, I feel very much protected by all of these relationships around me.
Man, Rich, you've talked a lot about community in this conversation. And if there's any kind of big idea that I'm taking away from the conversation, is just that placing myself and submitting myself to healthy community around me in many different aspects of my life and leadership. So good. Hey,
when young people tell me, what do I need? What are your secrets? For me, here's a secret. Surround yourself with enough wise people who are further ahead of you, who love you, and listen to them, submit to them, ask questions. For me, that's the secret.
Yeah. We have a little phrase, we have a little paraphrase here in our home, Rich, with our 3 kids. I've got a 20, 18, and 16-year-old. We've been saying it for years. It's Perko's paraphrase. Hang with the wise, you become wise. Hang with fools, you don't become a fool. You actually get hurt. And that's, powerful stuff. Not mine. That's, I believe a man named Solomon that wrote that. So, hey, give us a sneak peek. Are you allowed to give us a sneak peek into what's coming in the next book?
Oh yeah. It's fresh on my mind because I finished the manuscript in July.
Okay.
And on Friday, well, as of this recording, this past Friday, my editor sent me back all of his comments. And
was that a good experience or not?
It was good and painful. The good was tons of affirmation, and then a bunch of, what do you mean here? And this doesn't make sense. And we need to reposition this. So I threw away 4,000 words in one chapter just yesterday and replaced them with some new words, which was painful and a good practice for me. The book is called, the working title right now, and I think it'll be the final title, is Rooted in Love. Becoming Whole in a Fractured World. And really, I am writing about 3 questions. The first question is, how does love get uprooted from us? The second question is, how does love get formed in us? The third question is, how does love get embodied through us? So for the first section of how does love get uprooted from us, I'm writing about sin. And I think I'm offering a perspective of sin that by no means is it novel, but I think it's without question underappreciated and overlooked. And so I'm writing about sin to start my book. So that should be
that'll be a bestseller.
The second chapter is on powers and principalities and the ways that those forces uproot love from us. And then the third is on trauma. So how does love get uprooted from us? Obviously, so many ways, but I'm writing about sin, powers and principalities, and trauma. How does love get formed in us? I'm writing about contemplative prayer, humility, and self-differentiation, which comes out of family systems theory. I might repurpose that phrase, self-differentiation, but that's essentially what I'm trying to get at. And then how does love get embodied through us? I'm writing about 3 things there. I'm writing about navigating conflict, forgiveness, and justice. And so those are the 9 very large themes that I'm writing about as it relates to our lives being rooted in love.
So good, man. I'm looking forward to it. Do you have a date yet of when that may be?
I would say spring, summer of 2022.
All right.
Right around the corner.
So good. Love that. Hey, speaking of the release date, if people want to keep up with you, you talked about Instagram. What's the best way for people to track along with you, your ministry, and what you're writing about, what you're kind of putting out into the world?
Big picture. If folks went to Rich Villodas, VILLODAS.com, richvillodas.com, they could hear about the book I've written, the book that's coming, other resources that I send out from time to time for those who are part of the email list. So there, and then on Twitter and on Instagram, it's just at Rich Villodas. That's where I'm doing a number of things there. Number one, sharing about my intense love for sports, specifically my New York sports teams. That's what I'm doing on Twitter. It's usually lamenting. That's what I'm doing, and looking for those who are going to share in my suffering. So that's Twitter for the most part. It's there that I am connecting with new people and new friends that I've really enjoyed, and it's a place where I am often testing out sermon ideas and articles and books. So it's a good discipline. Those 280 characters, especially on Twitter, have served as a good discipline to hone my writing skills. So
nice.
That's what I'm doing there.
Okay. And Instagram, what do you use that platform for nowadays?
It's so funny. I made from time, sometimes just family stuff and my kid, but I think I made a shift early this year where I'm trying to use that space to do much what I do in Twitter is encouragement. And so it's often the case. This is what happens. This is not sophisticated at all.
Yeah.
I post something on Twitter. It seems like it resonates and it's helping people. And I do something, here it is. I take a screenshot and then I post it on Instagram. I know deep stuff here, but that's how I have come to use Instagram and then connect with a bunch of people on there as well.
Yeah, I love it. Well, Rich, this has been honestly a joy and a pleasure for me. And I appreciate you carving out time, mate, to just share some of the things that God's been teaching and forming in your life and the gift that it is to others to hear another leader sharing that. So thanks so much for your time, mate. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for having me, man. We'll do it again.
Sounds good. Well, what an incredible conversation with Rich. I loved how he distinguished the difference between celebrityism and being a celebrity. You know, for many people, it's impossible for them to not go noticed, and they become popular or they become well known in their community for the things that they do. But it's different from ordering your entire life around growing your platform of influence. And I just loved the way that Rich distinguished the difference between those two things. Hey, if you'd like to get your own copy of The Deeply Formed Life, Rich's book, or you're interested in more resources offered by Rich, then you can find links in the show notes below, both to the book and also to Rich's website. And I would just encourage you, if you're a leader that really values caring for your soul, Rich is the kind of guy that will help you to do just that. Hey, before I go, I want to make sure you don't miss any conversations like this one. So if you have not already done so, I want to invite you to go over to jasonperkoperkins.com. You can sign up for our email list. We let you know when episodes are being released. We also send out great resources and tools that will help you to reach your goals without losing your soul. I promise we're not going to send you an email every day or even every week. We just want to keep you informed of how you can care for your soul. Another great way to not miss an episode is to just hit that subscribe button on whatever platform you listen to this show on. If you feel inclined, and we would love it if you would consider doing this, by leaving us a review on your favorite podcast platform, it actually helps us to get these conversations to more people. Those reviews help us to get the word out to more and more people who need to hear these conversations. So if you'd feel inclined to do that, we would certainly appreciate it. And always, as always, I love hearing from you, those of you that listen to the podcast. So if you're finding the conversations helpful in feeding your soul, which is what the podcast is all about, I'd love to hear from you. We just want to see an entire generation of leaders reach their goals and at the same time hear them say, "It is well with my soul." So reach out to us, especially via Instagram is the best way to do that, at Jason Perko Perkins on Instagram. You can connect with me through the link in my bio in a number of different ways, and I'd love to connect with you. Hey, thanks so much for taking the time to listen to the episode today. I really appreciate it. I look forward to connecting with you online this week, and I can't wait to share another great episode, another great conversation of Perko's podcast with you very soon. Until then, cheers.